Running from this town, don't know where I'm going. Feet off the ground, show no signs of slowing down. That's okay, that's okay. Find my way, find my way back home. I've got a plan, you don't know it. See the future, but you don't show it. That's okay, that's okay.
Steve, good evening and welcome to the final event of this year's Dingle Lit Festival. Thank you all so much for joining us and I hope you've enjoyed everything. I think this last event is going to be an absolute cracker. I suppose this man needs no introduction at this stage. He has been probably on the Late Late Show more times than Gay Byrne over this summer. Professor Luke O'Neill is the chair of TCD Biochemistry School. He's an immunologist and has been the spokesperson for COVID in Ireland, I suppose. He's also a rock and roll professor. He's in a band called the Metabolics and no stranger to Dingle. He's played here at the Other Voices Festival before. Probably the last time I saw Luke, he was having the crowd absolutely going wild in Gainey's Bar a couple of years ago. He's spoken at the Ireland's Edge Festival as well. And he's also behind, one of the people behind a company called Inflazome, which has been doing a lot of research into drugs targeting Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other inflammatory diseases, which was recently acquired. I don't know why he isn't on a private island rolling in his millions, but thankfully he's still here to guide us through the crisis we've been going through. But tonight, Luke, I've said I'm going to try and not mention the C word too much because this book has been written before that all kicked off. It was in the publishers, wasn't it? Before everything changed.
It was, Deanna, strangely enough. People think I wrote it to cash in on COVID, but that's not true. Yeah, I wrote it, I guess this time last year. I was just finishing it. You know, I was finishing it this time last year, I suppose, really. And then I finished it in January and then sent it in early February, just when this was beginning to start. And then, you know, COVID broke and then I got the proofs in April. And I was able to update it with COVID stuff because it was quite easy then to drop COVID references in. I couldn't not put COVID in, could I? That would have been ridiculous, you know. So I could stick bits of COVID here and there. I mean, obviously the vaccines chapter, there's a massive chapter on vaccines, so I could bring COVID into that. But yeah, it's a funny one. The way for me, it's a startling fact that my book came out when all this is happening, you know, and it's a science book and how important science is. So it certainly was a matter of timing in some ways, I suppose.
For anyone who's not familiar with the book, it's called Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Science. And it's a little play on the Sex Pistols album. Obviously, anyone who knows Luke already will know he's a huge music fan. So there's lots of musical references in the book as well. And I found it so engaging, so entertaining, so interesting. I'm completely in awe at just the literal amount of crazy random facts that are in your head. But I have to say, some of the chapters, so basically this book is a scientist's guide to the biggest challenges facing us today. So some of the chapters, I laughed at, even the chapter names are just very direct. What makes you think you've control over your life? Why aren't you in jail? One of my favorites. Why are you working in a bullshit job? Why don't you just cheer up? All of these important questions, and you think science has the answers for us.
Well, I do, Deanna. I mean, the inspiration of the book was the publisher, Gill. I published a book called Humanology with Gill, you see, that came out about 2 years ago now, I suppose. And someone said, oh, you haven't got as much of yourself in Humanology. They can hear my voice, though, but they wouldn't have had much about my opinion on things. So they said, let's get more of that. And then Gil said, well, look, why don't you write a book about the big questions in science that really we all wonder about? And that was the only instruction I had from Sarah, Liddy, and Gil, who was my great commissioning editor. She was always a fantastic supporter. And then I went away and thought about the big things that interest me, you know, in society or in life and all the rest of it. And the 15 chapters began to emerge. I mean, it was sort of straightforward in the end. And then I realized pretty soon it was quite a serious book in a way, because these are serious topics. So the first chapter I wrote was the vaccine chapter for it. And again, pre-COVID, can you imagine? That was the first chapter I wrote. And then the next one was euthanasia, which is a very serious topic as well. And that worried me a bit. You know, so, is this working? And I was about a third of the way through it thinking, oh, this might be far too deep and, oh, you know, too tricky. But then I realized actually I was enjoying it, you know. And then there is great science that we can use then to inform us on these big topics. And so it became a bit more straight. Once I had the guts to do it, I did, you know. And then each chapter I put a little personal story in the front of, and then I'd finish with my bottom line. And then each chapter kind of had a structure to it in a way. But the topics were mainly ones that really fascinated me, I suppose. And I knew a fair bit about them already, of course. You have to have a bit of knowledge before you embark on the thing. And I could then write it quite straightforwardly, I guess.
One thing that struck me, actually, I thought was very nice when you mentioned adding something personal into it, is that the influence of your sister and your wife and strong women in your life really comes through, which I thought, and I'm almost like, I'd love to have an interview with your sister. She sounds like a fascinating little bit about her and her influence on you.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I wrote a chapter. One of the ones that really struck my sister was, why do you still think men are from Mars and women are from Venus? That was the title of that chapter. And it was trying to get at men and women and how we differ and how we're the same and all that kind of thing. An awful rubbish science behind that's been done in that topic, you see. And my sister was...
I don't know that chapter title. There was a self-help book, wasn't it, called Men Are From Mars, Women Are...
Yeah, that's right.
The difference between the sexes and how to sort of approach each other when men are clearly aliens.
Exactly. That's right. Exactly. And I mean, I did call that, the original title was why do you think men are from Mars and women are from Venus? And I realized because they're not, so why do you still think they are? Because all the evidence would suggest they're not. But we have an awful lot in common, you know. But my sister was a really ardent early Irish feminist, you see, and she was always, when I was growing up, my memory of her was really strident in her feminism, if you will, you know. And then she went to live in London, and she had a very interesting life over there, and she became a social worker and all that kind of thing, you know. And then I figured what a good thing to talk about and to give her some, you know, a bit of a shout out, really, because she is an unsung hero in many ways, and she spent her whole life as a psychiatric social worker in England, which wasn't easy as a job. So I dedicate the book to her, actually. I said she spent her life looking after all the lonely people. A Beatles reference there, you see. So that was quite a good way to recognize. And she was a big influence on me growing up. I mean, she got me to join Amnesty International when I was about 17, much to my mother's annoyance. My mother thought Amnesty was some awful cult, you know, that kind of thing. So and then when I went to live in London myself, then for my PhD, I shared a flat with her for a few months, and then we got to know her. She's 8 years older than me, so she's a bit of an age gap. And when I was like 11, she left home, so I didn't really know her, you know. But then we lived together, got to know each other, and I remember those days very fondly, you see. So I thought it was a good way to mention her because she is a big hero to me, you know.
Lovely. And another thing that really I thought was really interesting, actually, there's a chapter, probably in that chapter, where you talk about in education how girls and boys are treated very differently. And I think that'll be a very interesting chapter to any parents out there, especially in terms of how maths and science subjects are approached in school, because there is such a big push on in education at the moment to encourage, I mean, all children, but especially girls, into STEM subjects. And you've mentioned in this chapter about how, you know, that kind of traditional, oh, boys are better at maths than girls, their brains are that way. It's not true, is it?
Not at all. No, and in fact, all those studies that compared men and women or boys to girls are always flawed or biased by the investigator, and many have been debunked. And the bottom line is very simple: there's hardly any differences between us. I know that sounds a bit unusual, but it's true scientifically. The best you can say is women are inclined to be a bit more empathic, and men are inclined to be a bit more assertive and aggressive. That seems to be somewhat hardwired in us. And it makes sense because women are carrying the baby, for God's sake, you know, and they're the mothers. The men in the jungle or whatever are inclined to be a bit more protective, maybe. But it's a tiny difference. Many women can be very assertive as well, remember, and some men are empathic. All those traits eventually overlap, is what all these studies show. And the mathematics one is the best one for me because 30 years ago, the science allegedly was saying that men were great at maths and women weren't. It was just nonsense, you know. And as time has gone by and the studies have been repeated, it narrows and narrows, and now the two curves overlap, you know. Another great myth would be that men are much better at parking and driving cars than women. That was absolute nonsense, you know. And again, those studies were biased against one or the other, you see. And the biggest one that they got wrong was that men and women's brains are physically different. And there was this rubbish about 4 or 5 years ago that some women had more connection in certain parts than men, or certain bits were bigger. That was all nonsense. There was no truth in that at all in the end. No scientific basis for that. So what that chapter kind of says is we're very, very similar, really. And in fact, what you want us to be is complementary. Any differences that exist are there for us to work together. We're great when we're together. You know, we do things together, men and women, you know. And then, of course, everything's on a spectrum anyway. You know, there's a full range of traits here. So I think it's just a very important point to make. And as you say, it gets very serious in education. If anything, men are now being disadvantaged in education and women are being advantaged. And that's partly because there's a lot more female teachers, and they will treat the class slightly differently. And subconscious stuff goes on as well, you see. There's a worry now that men are getting left behind, if anything, in education. So that needs to be thought about as well. The latest studies are suggesting that, you know.
In terms of how our brains have evolved, actually, I think that's a very interesting thing to look at, because I suppose a lot of those differences that you mentioned, maybe where men were more aggressive, women were a bit more empathic, it all comes back from, you know, caveman times, cave person times, as we might say today. But our brains really don't seem to have evolved at the pace modern life has evolved, have they? I mean, in the pace of technology in the last few years.
In so many ways, Deanna. I mean, we are living in bodies that evolved for a very different environment to the one we're living in, you know? And that's why obesity and diabetes is a big problem, because we're now living in a world where we overeat the whole time. Whereas we evolved at a time when food was scarce and then plentiful. And our metabolism hasn't changed much, you see. So that's one example. But you're quite right, though. Yeah, the traits we talk about are often there because of the way the Stone Age world was, as it were, you know. And then it's quite hard for us to escape that world because we're tied by our biology. Now, maybe in 150 years' time, some will have died. Or maybe all the macho men will have died out, you see. And all those genes are now gone from the population, if that's seen as a disadvantage, you know. And you never know, we may change. But evolution takes a long enough time to wield, especially on something complicated. It can take hundreds of thousands of years, you see. So you're right, we're kind of trapped in these bodies, if you like, that evolve for different circumstances, I suppose.
So you don't think they're going to evolve that fast, that we're going to get little tails growing out of our necks and weird things from all of the texting that we're doing, like some people are kind of the rumors going around about?
Only if the woman chooses a man like that, because then those genes begin to dominate, you see. So that kind of thing might happen, I suppose. But we may evolve, though, into strange creatures. If we come back in 1,000,000 years' time, we will look very different if we're still here, let's put it that way. But not in the time scales we're talking. Remember, the modern world only has been going for about 3,000 or 4,000 years, really, you know. So in other words, if you went back 10,000 years now, the human behavior hadn't changed much in 150,000 years, really. You know, there's been these revolutions since then, and that's a very short time scale.
You know? One chapter that I love, right, because I personally quit my job in Dublin and moved down here to Dingle a few years ago, and I work out of this co-working space, Dingle Hub, which is hosting us this evening. And I just laughed when I read the chapter, "Why are you still in your bullshit job?" Tell me a little bit about that. I think a lot of the last few months will have maybe thought, you know, they've been working from home, they've seen different ways of living, they think they don't need to be living in cities anymore. I think this is something that might be a remote working, you know, revolution coming in the next year.
Well, exactly. That's my favorite chapter, actually, to be honest, of my own, Deanna, because that was built on a book by a guy called David Graeber, who wrote a great book that I'd read called Bullshit Jobs, you know, and intrigued me as an idea, first of all. And then the data is terrifying. Like 70% of people don't like their job or feel it's got no meaning, and they're kind of trapped in it, you know, and like we're all slaves in a way, you know. And the new slavery might be working for Google or Facebook. I'm not knocking them as employers now, but the big issue becomes, can you lead a fulfilling life? That's really what that chapter is about. And so many people say they aren't leading a fulfilling life, and that was intriguing. And in that chapter, I talk about remote working a lot. So when I wrote that, remember, it's pre-COVID, I wrote that chapter. And there's a whole 4 pages on remote working. and how certain companies had tried it. IBM had, Microsoft, and some didn't like it and some did, and the challenges of remote working. And that's exactly what's happened, isn't it, since COVID struck, I suppose. There's so many people doing remote working now. So suddenly that chapter became all the more relevant, I suppose, in the age of COVID. And then it also goes into the notion of fulfillment and what is it in a job. And my favorite little anecdote in the whole book is I'm a big fan of Lucy Kellaway, who I'm sure you've heard of, Deanna. She was a great journalist for the Financial Times. And I used to read her avidly, you know. And she wrote a great piece. And it's probably about 2 years ago. And I gave her full citation now as a good scientist, how she talks. She was very good at slagging off the workplace and especially the office life, you know, really witty stuff. But then she said that she never felt more fulfilled than when she came home from work one night and sat on a chair that her granddaughter had left her. And it was a very precious thing. And it broke from under because the cracks were so old. And she decides to fix the chair and does it properly. It's a chair from the early 1900s. She gets the right material. She masters how to put the nails in and the hessian. And finally, then the chair is now fixed and she can sit in it, you know. And then she wondered, why was I so happy doing that? She said. And then she knew about all these books about the workplace. She said, well, first of all, you have to have some kind of autonomy in the workplace. And autonomy was her fixing the chair whenever she wanted. Secondly, mastery. You have to master something. And that takes time and effort. And like a musician, for instance, you know, it takes a lot of practice to be a musician or anything really. And then thirdly, purpose. She's somewhere to sit is how she put it, you know. So I thought those, if you have those three things in your job, basically in your working life, you may feel fulfilled. And I thought that was a simple enough way to illustrate how to avoid the trap of working in the bullshit job, I guess. But now that we live in this modern world, we don't want people living in bullshit jobs or working in them. And then remember, a bullshit job just means it's no economic value to anybody. And I also discussed the minimum wage and the universal income. And that's what COVID has brought as well, strangely. That's one way to escape all this, you see. And then the last thing that's relevant is what constitutes a bullshit job has changed. So COVID has changed our perception of what's a very important job. And we now know, of course we do, that hairdressers, for example, is a big one, isn't it, for this, or cleaners, and all these people are really important to us, you know, and yet they were paid lousy wages for a long time, and they were seen as it's jobs that weren't that worthwhile. Well, now we always knew they were worthwhile in a way, but now that's very clear, isn't it? So I think maybe COVID has shone a very bright light on the workplace, actually, and might teach us how to live a better life in terms of our working lives.
But you're not suggesting everyone runs out and gives up their job, but I think it was interesting what you said there about, was it autonomy, mastery,
and purpose.
So I suppose there is that thing about job crafting where even if you stay in the same job, you can craft your job to make it more meaningful for you. You can
very much so. Yeah.
Gain from it in a reward and a personal reward kind of sense, or make it more rewarding for you.
Exactly. Well, I talk about something else there. You're dead right there. People have to make a living anyway. Let's not be too airy-fairy. You got to pay the bills, you know. It starts with that. And unemployment is devastating. Unemployment is much worse than working in a bullshit job for people psychologically. So let's not make any bones about that either. But the example I gave there was a man, and this is a well-known one. A man is building a wall. And you ask him, what are you doing? And he says, I'm building a wall. And then you might ask the second guy, what are you doing? He says, I'm building a wall for a church. I believe the building's a church. I'm building a wall for a church. And then you ask the third guy, I am building a wall for the greater glory of God. You know, so you have three totally different perceptions on the same job. Now, which of those three men felt the most fulfilled? It was the third guy, because he was doing something bigger, you know, greater than him kind of thing, you know. So any job can be configured. And then I talk about how the leadership is very important there to make sure people are aware how important their jobs are. And it can be anything. It can be any job. Every job is fulfilling and worthwhile. And the trouble is something's got disconnected from all that now. I mean, it's a strange one, isn't it? Where we don't have these sort of ideas behind the workplace anymore, and they need to come back in so many ways.
That's true. And I think you were so right there that it's very important for maybe, you know, the leader to inspire the people who are doing the jobs that, you know, can make that connection between what a simple task they might be doing and what good it is. I mean, for instance, in your world, maybe someone who's working on a factory production line in a drug company is helping someone recover from a horrible disease or a lifelong condition. So, you know, they're just putting a tablet into a box and sealing the box, but that's making a huge in someone's life. So it's making those connections.
That's right. Yeah. Every job has meaning, actually, if you look at it that way. And that's a really great thing to remind people of, I guess.
Yeah. So I think the last chapter of your book, I think, is something that maybe people would love to know a bit more about at the moment. You know, we're going into the winter. It's been a long series of lockdowns. everyone's kind of worried about what's going to happen for Christmas, all of that stuff. And I suppose in the longer term, what have we got to look forward to is the title of the last chapter. So what have we got to look forward to?
Yes. Well, now, do you mean in the next few months, Deanna, or the next few years?
I'm not going to make you be psychic, but what have you brought in that chapter?
Well, I try to make the point that science ultimately helps us remember. I mean, and that's the way it should be seen, as a beneficial thing for us all. And science has greatly enhanced our lives in so many different ways. Now, it can be negative because there can be things that go wrong and science can be misused, you see, is the worry you would have. But on balance, science is our friend and helps us move forward, is the idea there. And there's loads of examples in history where that's been the case, apart from ending up in a bullshit job, I suppose, because you might say the invention of Google gave rise to more misery. But by and large, science is beneficial. And I make the case, look, eventually we will thrive as a species, and that's the hope. The dream is there, and all these new inventions coming down the track are fantastic. You can't stop them, that's for sure. And we're going to have a lot more robotics and AI and all these things. And as a society, we got to get ready for that, and then figure out our best way through it, I suppose. And then in the case of the COVID-19, I mentioned COVID. There you have it. It is science that'll save us. In fact, COVID, if anything, to me, illustrates how fantastic science can be, because the only way out of this is through science. We can't escape this virus unless we use science. And that science can be used, obviously, for the vaccines, for the therapies in hospital. Science has done nothing so far for COVID, actually, except for the test, this clever PCR test. That's the only scientific contribution, really, so far. But of course, now it's coming. From now on, and literally today almost, certainly since the last couple of weeks, you will see science now beginning to contribute to our way out of this, you see. So all we got to do is sit tight now and get to the next phase of this pandemic. And science is the place where we will see the most benefits and the most advances, I think.
Yeah. So I want to say one thing. We have some questions coming in from our audience members, and we've had someone, carefully monitoring for any trolling, because we have, and I think you have before in your life, being subject to it. Some people are very anti-masks, some people are very anti-vaccines, and we had a little chat before we came on here this evening, and bring it on. I've got science to refute it with.
Yeah.
Confident in, if people, you're well known now, especially with Inflazome, there was a lot of attention around that company. There's been a lot of attention on the Late Late Show and News Talk regularly. So you're a household name these days, and you've got some trolling and abuse, which I think anyone who is a household name these days does.
Yeah.
Under scrutiny. And you're not fazed by it at all, are you?
Not in the least. No. I mean, if you're a scientist and you're in the media, you only have three things you need to keep an eye on as a scientist in the media. Now, many scientists don't want to be in the media, and that's fair enough. They're quite reclusive creatures, many of them, and they're in the lab doing what they're good at, which is to be doing experiments and figuring things out. But some of us have stepped up and done it. And I've done it before, Deanna, as you know, with News Talk and stuff. And I wrote the other books. I really enjoy science communication. It's our obligation, actually, as scientists to communicate anyway. The ones who want to do it. It's not a compulsory thing, because the taxpayer pays my wages, remember, through the Trinity and through various things. So of course I've got to tell people all about this. That's my obligation, really, in a way. And like this COVID-19 pandemic again really illustrates how we need scientists to be in the media, telling people, giving them updates, trying to get a bit of reassurance, and also be critical if we think things are going wrong. So I think it's an obligation to do it. But you've got to remember three things. Only go on the data. If you're a scientist, your job is to talk about data. Now, the trouble is with this COVID-19 thing, we don't have all the data. So we have to sometimes talk without data. And then I hate being asked for the pubs open, because there's no science to say they should or shouldn't. But still, sometimes you're drawn into it without the data. But number one, get the data out there. Number two, if you don't know, say it. Say, I do not know the answer to that question. Okay, just be honest that we don't know. And then the third thing is, it's not about you. It's about clearly explaining something as best you can to the audience. Now, when you get the people coming at you who are critical, and they were digging into you, there's all kinds of reasons why people do that. And it just happens. You can't do much about it. As someone said, if you play rugby, you're going to get hit, So that's the way it is. If they come to me with data, I'll try and counter it, of course. That's the only way I would look at something that's negative. And when I go to a conference as a professional immunologist, there's trolling there, but it's professional trolling. That's it. That piece of data, I've got different data to you. Your interpretation is wrong because here's my data. And I love that. I want that in science, because that allows science to move forward. It has to be a disputation, and even a very competitive thing as well. It's great, but the trouble is, if you have someone coming at you with no data, well, then there's no debate. and then you just say, bring it on. The only thing I worry about is if they're harming people, then you have to try and counter it.
Because
So masks are definitely beneficial, for instance. So we have to counter that one. Secondly, vaccines are very beneficial. Now, both of the, I don't call them anti-maskers, Deanna. They're mask deniers now. And there's no anti-vaxxers, they're vaccine deniers. The science is so strong that if you choose to go against that, you're denying that science. Unless you bring me science, of course, which supports what you say, that'll be okay. I can debate that science, you know. So it doesn't really, none of it bothers me. I'm just hoping that nobody gets harmed by these attacks. Now, it's easy for me because I'm old. I'm an old fella, basically. It's the younger scientists who get attacked that worry me because they get put off then and they worry you. My job is to reassure them. Don't be worried about that. You're going to get that, you know. So, but it's just it goes to the territory and you can't do much about it, really.
Yeah. So I'm going to take some questions now from the audience. I'm hopefully have them sent over to me. Let's see what they've been asking. Loads of questions here. So I'll just try and pick out some of the first ones in. So from Jack B asks, I would love to know more about the difference between potential side effects of new vaccinations versus potential side effects of new medications. Are you more likely to have serious complications from new medications that aren't around so long? I think it means vaccinations that aren't around a long time, or would it be similar as with new medications?
Oh, it's a great question, Jack. I mean, this is our number one concern, actually, is safety, because you don't want to harm people either with new medicines and new vaccines. That has to be uppermost in our minds. The whole purpose of medicine is not to harm people, remember? And there's always a risk of it. And vaccines can sometimes have unwanted effects. Now, it's extremely rare. And the consensus view is vaccines have to be used because the risk of them harming someone versus not vaccinating, causing massive harm through disease is vastly imbalanced, you know? And remember, you can understand his hesitancy, and I understand that, of course I do, but the problem with this is the evidence, and once it's approved, and these vaccines will be approved by these agencies, they will be considered safe to use, and my advice then is to use them based on that. We may need to do more work on convincing people because they're brand new and they've been gone very fast. People worry about that, for instance. But I will tell you for nothing, as soon as the FDA, the EMA approves a vaccine, I'll be banging on the drum, take this vaccine for definite. You know, every drug or every medicine will have some unwanted effect. It's the reality of the situation, you know, and you're trying to weigh up that unwanted effect versus the benefits. And the benefits by far outweigh the harm that, say, a vaccine or most medicines will do. You see, that's the overall, that's a consensus. That's just me now. That's the consensus view, you know.
I mean, every winter there's a flu vaccine, and every winter there's different strains. So there is flu vaccines coming out all the time. So I think,
yeah,
you know, everyone who's getting a flu jab every winter is getting a new flu vaccine, right?
That's right. Well, it is a brand new vaccine.
This one.
Well, no, it is a brand new technology. This RNA vaccine has never been approved before for human use, for instance. And we had to try something new because previous attempts to get vaccines for coronaviruses failed, you know? So there was no point in doing the same old thing again, you see. So, and we're delighted with these 2 RNA vaccines. I mean, no one imagined they'd be as efficacious as they are. It's staggeringly important what's happened there. Now, again, we got to wait for the data, wait for the safety data, wait for the 2 big agencies, the EMA in Europe and the FDA. And they were invented to protect us, remember, us people. The FDA was invented to stop people selling snake oil. That's how it first originated. So we need them now to report, remember. Now, I'm confident that they're going to say yes, because I've heard on the grapevine through my connections that these are safe vaccines, you know, and the efficacy spectacular. Now, we all need to go back to some kind of life, remember, and especially economically. And look at the music industry destroyed overnight here. You know, look at all the retailers. The vaccine is the way out of this. It's the only way out. I'll tell you that for nothing, right? So therefore, we have to go with this. And then, of course, we have to have faith in the EMA and the FDA and all the scientists and everything. And I have no reason to say there's nothing to worry about here in a sense. I'm absolutely confident that we're going to be okay through these. But again, it's going to be a stepwise process. We're not 100% sure what I just said there, because it is a process that we're going through at the moment. But all the data so far, remember, it's all about the data, says full steam ahead with these vaccines.
I'm going to hop around with the questions here. We have a few on sort of different topics now. So David and Bernadette ask the really important question: why did you choose the Sex Pistols for your title of your book?
Well, it was a burst of inspiration last Christmas after about 4 bottles of wine. No, it was well, it was going to be called something like "Isn't Science Great?" or something boring, and we had a working title like that. That's not good enough. And suddenly it came to me at Christmas. Never mind the ball. I'm a big fan of the album, by the way. I knew it. I think I was 14 years of age when the album came out. in the 70s, and I was a massive fan of it, you know. So it's kind of in my deep subconscious, that album title was there. And then I did a mock-up of the cover, Deanna. So this is literally over Christmas last year. I got the Sex Pistols album and I pasted science over Sex Pistols, right? And I sent it to Gil, to Sarah, thinking she'd say, no way, we can't have the word bollocks. And to my absolute delight, oh yeah, she says, great title. So that's how it happened, you know. And I think that it is a slightly serious thing in that we're sick of all the bollocks, aren't we? You know. So science was invented actually in a way to counter bollocks. So therefore, that's what the title really achieves, I suppose.
You could have called it "Never Mind the Fake News" in this era, certainly.
Yeah, that would have had the same resonance, though. Yeah.
Definitely, it's about proving things with real data. So, another interesting question here. Brian Maloney has asked, I don't know if it's your area, Luke, but is there any way from looking at gene trends from the past to the present to see how humans will evolve from the present into the future? Or is it a mixture influence of random mutation and everything?
That's a great question. No, I do know a lot about that because I work on this. I mean, I teach biology to the students in Trinity, and I give my first few lectures I call The Origin of Life, actually, and how life evolved on Earth, and then how we got to humans through this evolutionary process. So it's close to my interests as a teacher more than a researcher, I guess. Well, it's natural selection. I mean, traits are selected out by the environment, but it is random, you know, and someone randomly might have a certain genetic profile, and that will begin to dominate because the prevailing conditions allow that to dominate. Never think of evolution as a targeted process towards advancement. It's not that. It's purely random, you know. So what will happen next with human evolution? People have speculated on this. They reckon our eyesight is going because we're using far too much artificial light, and you won't need strong eyes anymore, kind of thing, to light things up. That's one example they're given. If we go into space, of course, that could have a big effect, because again, you wouldn't be worrying about weight being, you know, having heavy bones anymore. They might get lighter because that might have an advantage over the heavy boned ones, you know. So you can speculate a bit on what the future is, but it won't be in our 5 or 6 lifetimes. Let's put it that way. It's going to be a while developing. The other big one that happened to us in evolution was we had sex with cavemen. That's in my previous book, remember. So Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals. Okay. And we picked up loads of very interesting genes in the offspring that allowed those to persist. One of which is our immune system. We got some of our immune genes from Neanderthals, and they would have survived infection then, and those genes begin to dominate. So you do see evolution happen sometimes faster for some genes, especially the immune system ones. You can imagine if a good example actually is if HIV had run rip on the world and there was no anti-HIV therapies, there was a couple of variants of immune genes that made you resistant, and they would have begun to dominate because everybody else gets wiped out, you see, by the virus. So it's a very interesting topic in terms of which genes will persist in the population through evolution.
There was actually some talk of Kerry having a lower incidence because of a certain gene and blood type down here. So if the virus had run riot, I think Kerry people...
You never know. You never know, exactly. Well, one was blood groups, interestingly. Certain blood groups seem to be somewhat protective. That hasn't quite held up. There's science and action for you, by the way. I think we thought the A blood group was slightly more protective, it seemed. But that may not be quite true. But something simple like that could persist if a virus... Now, we don't want the virus killing everybody, do we? So, but yet infections are one of the biggest pressures we have on evolution through history. There's no doubt about that.
Another question to do with genomics, this is from Louise. Does Luke think that advancements in science such as genomics will become a standard in primary care to move our current healthcare model from reactive to proactive care? And if so, what kind of timeline do you envisage?
That's the dream. It's called personalized medicine. So in other words, if you could tailor every medicine to the specific patient, that'd be tremendous. And that's happening kind of slowly. I mean, a good example is Herceptin, which is given for breast cancer. If you carry a gene called HER2, you're going to be susceptible to Herceptin, would work on you. If you're HER2 negative, it won't, you know. So one of the big dreams of the big drug companies is to do personalized medicine. They want their medicines to work after all, you know. And there's a range. Remember, everything in biology has what's called a normal distribution, you know. Some respond, some don't, many in the middle. If you could map exactly who would respond, you'd have a much more effective therapy. And then secondly, it is about disease, the mechanism of disease. So if you could find, like, there could be 30 reasons for, say, Crohn's disease, complicated as it may seem. And you may have one type, and a drug will be designed then specifically for you. The other big advance that we're hoping for is gene therapy, where you can correct broken genes. Many diseases are caused by genetic differences. Like cystic fibrosis is the best example, of course, we might say in Ireland. That could be cured through genetic manipulation, just correct that gene. And again, that's beginning. We're seeing 1 or 2 examples of genetic diseases being corrected with gene therapy, which would be brilliant in a way, because that could be the ultimate answer to many diseases, you see.
Yeah. So Neil asks, have you any fear that the pharma companies have too much control over all our lives? They are not elected to look after us. Their interests are purely monetary.
That's a reasonable point, actually. Yeah, and I'm involved with them. Like a third of my trolls are saying you're in the pay of drug companies, which is partly true. I mean, if you're an academic like me and you want to make a new medicine, you have to get into bed with drug companies, right? That starts with that, because they have very, very deep pockets. They can afford to do the clinical trials, which are very risky. Remember, it takes, and that there's a chapter in the book actually. Why are new medicines so expensive? It's called. And it ends with my hope that medicine should be free to everybody. That's my ultimate dream. Now, can we get there? It's a very expensive business. Who pays all the costs of developing drugs? It's drug companies. And they need to raise money through their own business and so on. So it is tied up in the business world. But the fact is that nobody else can make drugs. It's too expensive. You know, not a single drug was invented in the Soviet Union to benefit humanity, for example. It seems to need capitalism, horrible and all as that may be to some people, you know. Now, what we need then is regulation. Of course, like any industry, it has to be regulated, and there are very egregious examples in pharma of things not being done properly, shall we say. So we need the governments to regulate these companies. The other thing I'd say is there'll be no pension. Nobody will be earning a pension without drug companies. Many of the pension funds are invested in pharmaceuticals, for instance, and they make a profit and then pay your pension. So it's a very complicated thing, actually. It's easy to kick them and dig into them, actually. It's quite easy. But the truth is they're the only ones making new medicines, and we have to work with them and hope it's well regulated.
Very, very tangled web. Hugo is asking, what's your view on the constant defiance towards science, like flat earth, anti-vaxxers, all of that?
You get that. It's been going on since the history of humanity, probably, actually. You know, there's always someone who's saying dissenting, and we don't mind dissent in science. As I said, it's supposed to be combative because you want science to advance, and that means being critical. And being critical is a very important trait in a scientist. The second thing is skepticism is very high in scientists. They don't quite believe what they see. They want more evidence, you know. So it's very much part of what it is to be a scientist. Now, the problem is if you have someone, as I said earlier, going against you with a conspiracy theory, it's just about evidence. If they can produce the evidence, great. You know, science should only be about data. That's all. And then you get on to interpreting the data, which is the next thing to talk about, I suppose. But overall, science is inclined to move along. It gets data and you reach a consensus view. There's still people who will deny climate change, you see. And they still come to conferences and stand up and, you know, criticize some of the data. That's okay. But eventually their voices get drowned out. In other words, the evidence has to become so loud that nobody can deny it. And if they do, it means they're not listening to the evidence and not being a scientist, actually, you know. But it happens, and it's fine. I don't mind. People can say the earth is flat if they want. It's a free world, you know.
I suppose leading on from that, Gregory has asked, how can we know what to believe out of what we are told has been scientifically proven? I mean, I presume what has been scientifically proven is peer-reviewed.
Yeah. Well, it does get things wrong. You can't be holier than thou either. Science isn't perfect, and nor are scientists. I hate to say it, being one myself. We're imperfect creatures, and sometimes there's biases or they overemphasize things. But eventually, science gets to the truth. That's the bottom line. I'll give you one example in my own career. So when I began as a scientist working on rheumatoid arthritis, it was a crippling disease, horrible disease, people in wheelchairs. And then a molecule called TNF is found in the immune system. And nobody believed it initially, and there was evidence against it, and it goes back and forth. Finally, a drug is developed to block TNF, and this has a massive effect in patients. In other words, rheumatoid is now a disease where you don't end up in a wheelchair. And that was a lot of science, a huge amount of analysis and labs and trying to repeat things and contradictions. It eventually gets there. The truth that science is actually real could be a disease that's being treated and patients are benefiting. That's one example of how science delivers, I suppose, and all that stuff. In other words, the controversies fall away when the evidence is irrefutable. And irrefutable evidence in the case of what I work on is a new medicine to treat disease. And that's the game over. You know, there's no more debate. There was a lot of debate before, but now it's all over. And every aspect of science ultimately has that. Science is only about the truth. That's actually what its goal is. And there will be dissent, and there will be contradiction, and there will be controversy, but it eventually gets there in the end, or it's still stumbling in the dark sometimes. You know, it's a process that we're in, you see. So these are very important aspects to what science actually is trying to achieve.
Look, we're running out of time, but I want to try and get a couple more questions in. So the latest one we have is Gráinne Murphy asks, is there any data to show that supplementation with vitamin D helps protect your immune system?
There's great data with vitamin D actually. And in fact, the good part about that is we know some of the mechanisms, because again, and it gets back to the previous kind of question in a way, if you get a real mechanistic basis for something as to why something is doing something, then you know you're onto something. You know, there could be something in this. The big challenge of science is always correlation and causation and a break in that. You know what I mean? So in other words, you know, does smoking cause cancer? That was initially a correlation. And the drug and the tobacco company said that's just a correlation. But then we knew there were chemicals in tobacco causing genes to mutate to make tumors grow. Game over. Smoking causes cancer. Vitamin D, yeah, there's great evidence that it's a great vitamin for the immune system. In fact, it was first discovered as a vitamin for your bones. And in fact, a deficiency was causing rickets, which was a horrible disease years ago. Vitamin D helps your bones grow. And then they find it double jobs. It also was needed for the immune system. So we know it's a really good sort of immune factor, if you will, to help the immune system do its job. And then we move on and worry about deficiency. Now, most people don't get deficient because it's in your diet. A regular balanced diet will give you enough vitamin D. A bit of sunlight is tremendous, by the way. Don't get sunburned, though, remember, because of the risk of skin cancer. But a bit of sunlight's great. The trouble is older people, their skin is a bit thinner and they can't make as much vitamin D, and they may be malnourished because they're not having the right diet. So maybe you supplement them. And there are trials running now with COVID to supplement people with vitamin D. At the moment, it is a correlation thing that looks good. Let's now get more evidence that vitamin D supplementation might help in COVID, as idiots. It's a work in progress in terms of COVID. But it's certainly worth remembering that a balanced diet, in every sense, like a proper balanced diet, is one of your immune system's best friends, and that will have enough vitamin D in it.
There's so many great questions here. I'm going to try and squeeze a few more in. So Max Hayes wants to know, if you were elected tomorrow, what would you do as a politician?
I'd fire the government. No, well, I could never be a politician. I thought that's too. I was asked that on the radio last week. Someone said, Luke, you should be Minister for Health because he's always waffling. And I said, but to be Minister for Health, you have to waffle. That's kind of part of the job. But more seriously, what would I do if I was elected? Oh, God, that's a tricky one, isn't it? I think I'd do something serious, actually. I'd have a second committee to NEFIT actually advising me. I would have NEFIT are very important, as we know. And they're medics and some mainly scientists. They're mainly actually civil servants who work in the Department of Health, but there's also some medics. And they're very good, don't get me wrong. And they will always give you medical health advice. But it's such a complicated question now. We need another kind of committee with other people on it that would advise the government. I'd also make sure there's more scientists on NEFIT, actually. There aren't enough, because you need the scientific voice there as well. So I might reform my advisors slightly, I suppose.
Very important question from Kevin. When do you think we'll get back to live gigs?
Oh, well, Kevin, I'm longing for that myself. The metabolics will return to Dingle one day, I promise you. So, well, it's such an important question. And in the metabolics, we had two professional musicians, the great Chris Cole, our guitarist, and Paul Feary, our bass player. It's been a disaster for those guys, as you can imagine. We all know this. Like overnight, the light was switched off for them. So it's terrible. And they're doing their best to do a bit of teaching on Zoom and stuff like that. But isn't it it's the most surprising thing that a virus has destroyed what we love most of all, you know? So I think what's going to happen is this. We will have the vaccine. It will begin to get rolled out early next year. It won't be everybody initially. Middle of next year, you'll see widespread vaccination happening. And then we can begin to hold events with more than 100 people potentially in a space that's relatively safe. And that means gigs are back. Now, Ticketmaster, have you seen that? Deanna did something very interesting this week in America. They're saying that if you buy a ticket, you can only buy a ticket if you're verifiably vaccinated to a gig, right? Isn't that interesting? Now, that could be seen as Big Brother territory, but that's not a bad idea if you think about it. In other words, you can't make vaccines mandatory because that denies people's civil liberties. But you can just say, I'm sorry, you can't come to the gig unless you're vaccinated. That's your choice. You know, you don't want to go to a gig. So we may see evidence for vaccination on your ticket as you enter a venue. And that's great. Imagine if you go to a gig with 1,000 people and you know they're all vaccinated. My God, that's a safe thing to do. You know, there's no fear. The risk is massively lowered, basically, if that's the situation. So we may see that beginning to happen, that kind of thing. I'd like to think that people would voluntarily vaccinate and you wouldn't have to, you know, force people to vaccinate, or not force them, but, you know, put up measures if they don't. It's better if it's by consensus. But I think vaccines are the way back to gigs for definite.
I think either that or the giant plastic bubbles that the flaming lips.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, not the same though, is it? It's not quite. You know, a great line, Deanna. I heard Tommy Tiernan interviewed recently, and someone asked him, "Would he do a comedy gig by Zoom?" He was asked, right? He said, "I'd rather go down to the end of my road and shout at trucks going by." Was his answer. You know? which I thought was a great way to put it, because it's impossible to do anything else. You can't beat the live experience, can you? And that gig we did that night in Guys was fantastic. The crowd are there, we're all together. It's a communal thing. It's just fantastic feeling that we all get out of it. You can't replace that with anything else, really.
It's true. I mean, it's such a, like, that dancing, music, all of these things, like in every culture throughout history, have been in human communities. So I think it's something that we're all really, really missing. One last question, because I know you've mentioned that you are working on a new book, and Rishtard is asking, what will your new book be about? I thought I had the scoop that you are working on it, but
that sounds like a plant, Rishtard. It's not a plant question. Well, about 2 weeks ago, Gil asked me to do another book, and I said, what do you want? And they said, could you do a book called Corona Coaster? I said, what the hell is that? It's my journey through Corona, right? So in other words, I've got lots of, I've got a diary, not like a little teenage diary. I'm talking about my schedule, if you like, right? So I'm going to give my own Corona Coaster story. I first heard about this virus on January 6th, for instance. And then it was called the Wuhan virus, no name, And I just wrote the first 1,000. I told you, Deanna, first 1,000 words this afternoon. At least I had to go with the first few words anyway. So I've started it. They want it by March, to be finished by March. So it will be the story of coronavirus through my lens, shall we say. And then they want me, and it's fantastic because I mean, my lab works on corona. I've got like 4 projects in my lab doing research on it. So, and I'm following it every day, obviously, because I'm an immunologist and it's my area. And I'm going to give, and the triumph, Deanna, I'm hoping that in March, we'll see widespread vaccination beginning in Ireland, and won't that be a great day? And that might be the last sentence in the book. You never know. So that's the book I'm working on at the moment.
Rose McQuillan said, delightful conversation. Thanks, Luke. She's asked any chance of a song, but I'm afraid Luke does not have his guitar with him tonight. We'd already sounded out the possibility with him.
You should have given me more notice. I might have had to go then.
We were hoping for paperback writer, but next year in Dingle.
Next year, absolutely.
And actually, sorry, one more excellent question. David and Bernadette asked, how do we avoid a lockdown in January?
Well, that's such an important question as well. Well, I did a piece today in the Sunday Independent actually to talk about that, and I'm saying, how can we have a safe Christmas, really? Because the fear will be we won't have a Christmas that will be antiviral, shall we say, whatever the way to put it is. So we have to we've
lost you there, Luke.
No, I'm coming back. Hang on, that's my battery going. That's my battery going. It's good timing. We need to have a safe Christmas, which means keep the viral count down. If we can keep the virus down, it will be down in the next 2 weeks, I bet you. I think they're going to make the decision the 1st of December. So the virus will be low, then keep it low through December as best we can. Now, we can't avoid it going up a bit because we are going to mingle at Christmas. You can't stop us, really. And even if we tell people not to, they will. Mm-hmm. So there will be guidelines coming out next week about how to have a safe Christmas. My hope is that allow maybe three households can meet around Christmas time. That'll make a big difference to us, I think, And then when we're meeting as 3 households, observe all the guidelines, bit of distancing, good ventilation, wear a mask. Except having your turkey and ham, that's okay to take your mask off. But there will be a way for us to have a safe Christmas, I hope. And then expect a kind of a little spike in January, not so high, though, that we'll have to go back into level 5. So we may see level 3, level 4 bumping around a bit like that. And we can probably live with that, I think. I put in the piece in the Sunday Independent down, actually, the most depressing day of the year is the 3rd Monday every January. Famously, have you heard this, So let's get ready for that. If they introduce lockdown on that day, can you imagine? So I think we can do it. We can do it all together. What I like about this is, or at least the thing we can all emphasize is we're all in this together, and if ever we needed a community spirit as a nation and all over the world, really, through this Christmas more than ever, I think we can do it if we just keep an eye on each other and look out for each other and try to remember that we can help each other as best we can with these restrictions, and then we'll get through it. And then we can look back at it and go, we did well there for each other. We helped each other. That's the ultimate goal, I suppose, in this sense.
Actually, it was very interesting. The New York Times this week did a huge survey where they sent out questions to, I think it was immunologists, but they sent it out to thousands and they got hundreds of responses of how they were spending Thanksgiving. And very much their responses were not doing Thanksgiving, staying at home, staying on my own. If they were having a family get together, they were having it they were doing it outside in open air. Dinner, they were having hot cider or something, or they were doing it in their garage with the doors open. So people are, you have to just make changes this year.
That's what we need to do, actually. Yeah, and that's a good thing. Deanna, they have given guidelines for Thanksgiving. Now, it's not as what we would want, and we can maybe be a bit looser in Ireland because we're going to be anyway. We can't have our dinner outside in the garden, can we? For God's sake, that seems unlikely. But you can have a room which would be safe, because you'd have staggering around the table, not in the Irish way of staggering, but staggering around the table, a bit of distancing. Don't spend too long in the room having your dinner. I know it sounds a bit miserable, but maybe an hour and a half. Here's a suggestion in my piece today, Deanna. For the family gifts, hide them in the garden. Have a little gift hunt to be outdoors in the fresh air, And then, of course, it's very important for extra minced pies and milk and carrots for the reindeers, because Santa's going to be bringing special gifts for the children, because he knows they've done so well. They've worked so hard, haven't they, over the last few months? So there's a chance for us to have something of a celebration if we just sort of, again, follow these kinds of guidelines. It should be possible.
Luke, thank you so much. I'm sorry we have to end this, and I'm sorry we have to end the festival this year. I'm so looking forward to hopefully being in a room together next year. Maybe we can talk about your new book then.
Love to.
Hopefully Corona Coaster will be just a distant memory and all but the name of your new book.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I'd love to come back to Ding. That'd be great. I can't wait.
We'll hopefully see you then. I'd just like to say before we wrap up, thank you to everyone who made the festival happen. I mean, so many people from the committee, the sponsors, the founders, the arts and grants organizations, you, the audience, thank you so much. Everyone who's donated money towards keeping the costs of the festival covered and to run it again next year. And very much last but very much not least is our technical and broadcast wizard, Max, who has helped us bring this to you online. So thank you so much, Max, for all of your hard work, because really he was the only person who no one else could fill in for a part over this whole festival. So if something had happened to Max this weekend, you would not have had a festival. So thank you so much to him. Tosúlagam fecinn sibh gléir I gcomhar Cuimhne an bhliain seo cúin. I hope we'll see you all in Dingle next year. Gur míle maith agah, and I can reveal that we have decided the dates for your diary are the 19th, 20th and 21st of November next year. So I do hope we'll see you bio I gcomhar Cuimhne then. Slán live.